You're listening to the Sonny Brown Breakdown. Now, it is time to break it down.
Welcome to episode number 26 of the Sonny Brown Breakdown. I'm your host, Sonny Brown, and in this episode, I talk to Robert Drysdale. Now, of course, Robert Drysdale is a storied BJJ competitor. He's an ADCC champion, Mondials champion. He's coached many legends of the sport, competed in MMA and the UFC, but he actually also studied as a history major. And he's recently spent his time delving into the history of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and has been putting a film together entitled Closed Guard, The Origins of Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil. And that kind of traces the journey of Judo and Kosen Judo specifically, and then Mt. Maeda, and how that travels into Brazil and kind of leads to the sport that we know today. So we get into the good discussion about some of the particulars about the history and George Gracie and Carlos Gracie and a few of the stories that kind of make the myth and the truth kind of combine together. And that's where I think the real interesting part of the discussion takes place, where it's that balance of the truth and the myth. And was it Mt. Maeda that made the legend of Carlos Gracie, or was it Carlos Gracie that made the legend of Maeda? And it's an interesting thing to think about. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. This was recorded a month or two ago, and I was just trying to clean up the audio as much as possible. So you will hear like a dog bark at the start, but that stops and should be fine for the most part. And if you have any feedback on the episode, please email it through sonnybrown@gmail.com, or follow me on Instagram. I'm active there, Sonny Brown Breakdown. And yeah, let's go to the podcast. Okay, Robert Drysdale, how are you today, mate?
I'm doing great, man. Thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me to be on the podcast. And looking forward to catching up.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's your competitive career has been, illustrious, known for a long time. But today we're going to really get into the history of the actual sport that you do yourself and that we all do, in the history of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, because you've started producing a documentary called Closed Guard on the history of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And I'm wondering, what made you start looking into the history of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? What was the impetus to actually think, okay, what's the roots of this sport that we do?
It's interesting because, my other passion outside of Jiu-Jitsu has always been history. I'm a history major. As a child, I was obsessed with combat, but I never thought I'd be a fighter. I had in my head I was going to be an archaeologist. When people ask me, what are you going to go to college for? I'm like, archaeology. I had it in my head. That's what I was going to be in. But, I got infected with the Jiu-Jitsu bug when I was 16, and, there was tunnel vision from then onwards. But on my free time, I was always like reading history books and the humanities in general. And I felt very strongly that if BJJ didn't exist, that's probably what I'd be doing for a living, like something in that realm. But ironically, I'd never been interested in the history of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. There was a part of me that was a little skeptic and suspicious. If you're more familiar with any historical topic, you know that you can't simplify things into a linear approach to developments. A history is not linear, it's bushy. It goes in many directions, and it does that, and it's very complex. And you can't say, Kano, Maeda, Carlos, Helio. It's too simple to do that, And I remember when this happened, I was at the gym, and one of my students asked me why didn't I not have a picture of Carlos or Helio on my wall like a lot of gyms do. And it wasn't because I disrespect them or because I don't believe in their role. It's just because I don't know enough about history for me to put anyone's picture on the wall. So I had two reactions. I put the picture of my instructors, the people who had taught me over time. I put their pictures on the wall because I know what they did for me as far as Helio and Carlos. I didn't know enough for me to put their pictures on the wall. So I don't, think you shouldn't just believe something because people tell you to. You should, look into it yourself. But it did challenge me a little bit because I did realize I knew close to nothing about the history of BJJ. And I remember that right around the time, I remember seeing a book at a friend's house, Ray Casillas in Tennessee. I was just visiting him for a seminar. And on his shelf, there was a book called Choque by Roberto Pedreira. The Untold Story of Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil. That was the name of the book. And it was a thick volume. It was volume 1. There's 3 of them, and they're big volumes. And I'm thinking, oh, wow, I had no idea something like this existed. Why have I never heard of this? So I started going through it, and I found it was very rich in sources, and it was done very academically. And when I'd ask everyone, no one had ever heard of the book. And the few people who had heard of it, like, oh, man, it was too heavy for me to read. Like, people just didn't enjoy reading it because it didn't read like a novel. It read like, cataloging historical events. So it was a heavy read, and it was meant to inform people, not really entertain them. But I did enjoy the read. I also read a book called ĝʀᴏᴏᴜ Guardião Samurai, the Guardian Samurai. ĝʀᴏᴏᴜ. It was a book in Portuguese, and it had a lot of the same sources that Shockey had. And when I started reading these, I was like, man, people don't know about this. And I started asking friends of mine, people like old timers, like, have you heard of this? And like, no. Did you know about this? Or like, no, I never heard of that. And they thought I was making it up. And I'm like, they're not making it up. Like, they have primary sources here. Like, these guys aren't crazy. They're professional historians. So I didn't know what they're doing. And then later I found more research, and I found a PhD dissertation by José Tufi Cairus. And there was, I think it's called The Gracie Clan and the Making of Brazilian Nationalism. I can't remember the exact title, but if you Google it, Gracie Clan, the Making of Brazilian Nationalism, José Tufi Cairus, it'll come up. Like, there's got another article about the same talk, but like, they're very well researched, and the story that we're telling wasn't completely different from the one we had heard from our instructors, from what was on Wikipedia and other websites, but it was different. It was different. I became increasingly interested in the story, and I was trying to get people to read these books, but people weren't interested. So I figured, how can we tell this story in a way where we can bridge the gap between, the martial art enthusiasts and this academic work? And I figured that the only way we can bridge that gap is through a film. Now, here's the problem. I have zero experience in film. I mean, I like watching them. I don't think that counts as experience, really. But I have this thing in my head where, like, if I want to do something, it doesn't matter what it is. Like, if I get something in my head, I'm going to make it happen. And, it wasn't an easy process getting involved. I probably drove our production team crazy more times than I can count because, partially because of my lack of experience and partially because I'm very stubborn. If I want to tell something in a certain way, like, I put my foot down, and if I believe I'm right about something, I can't lose that fight, right? So I wanted to tell something that was unbiased, and I wasn't worried about stepping on eggshells. Like, I wasn't worried about upsetting people. There was zero concern over political correctness, nationalism. There's no partisanship. It's like, boom, straight down the middle. That was always my angle. The problem is the narrative is so old that anything that challenges it is immediately seen as hate. So by trying to be in the middle, I get accused of being, hateful and envious and diminishing the role of Brazilians or diminishing the Gracie family or, oh, you're just angry because you lost 2 finals of the Worlds to Roger. My answer is always, yeah, I'm angry. I'm very angry. But that has nothing to do with the film. They're very different. They're very different things here, like they coexist and there's no contradiction there. But I never wanted to attack anyone. But when I'm reading about how Maeda's role is grossly exaggerated, and it's not that he didn't do anything, but like we made him sound like he was this creator of something, and he taught Carlos, and you're looking at the sources, and there's none of that. The story that's coming across is a very different one. Most of Maeda's fights were fake. When he moves to Brazil, he's practically retired. He becomes more of a diplomat, socialite, and, a sort of like a representative of Japanese immigrants in the Amazon. He's less and less interested in fighting. He passes on the torch to his Brazilian students. And there were at least, 6 of them that we can verify for sure. 5 in the Amazon and then 1 in Rio, man who trained with them for a few months, but we can verify it. And none of them are Carlos Gracie. And Carlos Gracie doesn't appear in the story until much later. And even so, it's a very, very small role. So it's clearly exaggerated. Whatever relationship he had to Maeda is the one thing all historians agree on is that it's exaggerated. Like, you're never going to meet a historian like, oh no, everything Carlos said was true. That guy doesn't exist, right? It's always, the degree to which he exaggerated is what people can disagree on. But I didn't feel that diminished his role. Like, I think his importance is very real, but for different reasons they give themselves credit for. And it's the same with Helio. I think Helio is very important to the story, but for different reasons that they give themselves credit for. They didn't revolutionize technique. The Japanese were light years ahead of them. And you can't even begin to dispute this. Like, it blows my mind that some people want to argue with me. It was like, how can you even begin to argue that? Because my inbox blows up, right? Of course, I've been called anti-Gracie and pro-Gracie. You know, like, I've been called both, which tells me I'm on the right track. You know, but because like when the fundamentalists on both ends of the spectrum are angry at you, it tells me that I'm on the right track. So I take this as positive. But you know, Helio was very important for resisting the spread of judo. Judo would have taken over had it not been for Helio. I believe that. Like, some historians disagree with. They think that Helio's role was very exaggerated. I don't think it's exaggerated. I think he's very important, but not because he revolutionized technique. He didn't invent guard. He didn't invent leverage. In fact, if you watch him grapple, and from all accounts, it was very basic. It was very simple. I don't think he really created anything other that he was the strong man in the face of a movement of resistance towards judo, a movement that almost dies many times. It practically disappears in the 60s and 70s and 80s, makes a comeback in the 90s. But I think that without a strong personality like Helio, we'd all be doing judo today. So we owe him things. And Carlos was a marketing genius. Like, if Carlos Gracie had a Twitter account, he'd have like 20 million followers today. You know, like he had that, he understood PR very, very shrewdly, very, very cunning man for his time. You got to give him credit for that. Did he reinvent martial arts? No, he was teaching judo because that's what he was taught. What did Helio teach? He taught judo. It was just simplified, modified judo. It was ground-oriented judo. I'll give you an example. When you talk to Japanese that witnessed the evolution of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and the spread of it around the world, when they first started seeing Brazilians, they were surprised Brazilians were calling it Jiu-Jitsu, because Jiu-Jitsu to them was a very archaic, old term, and it didn't make any sense for them to use it because clearly they weren't doing Jiu-Jitsu. They were doing judo. The Japanese are like, why are you calling Jiu-Jitsu? It's clearly judo. You know, so I call it Brazilian judo. I don't call it Brazilian jiu-jitsu. I mean, it's not going to change anything, but like a more accurate description of what we do would be Brazilian judo, because that's what it was. It's just niwaza. That's what we practiced. You know, it's just that Brazilians got so good at it that, you know, once you change the rule set, you create a new martial art. And that's long story short, that's what happened. And we wanted to tell the story of all the forgotten characters. Like, there are many, many people that we feel were left out of the story. And we wanted to tell them because we feel they're relevant. Like, members of the Gracie family, not just other Japanese and other Brazilians, but like George Gracie. Most people have never heard of him. Very important character in the history of BJJ.
Okay. So it sounds to me that those books you mentioned, that I've heard them, you know, recommended online, and pretty much always in the same sentence is that they're very hard to read and very dry academic texts, and you might not actually enjoy it. It seems to me that, you know, because of that nature, you've decided to make something that's a bit more entertaining, a bit more digestible, and that the differences between the commonly accepted myth and what we have as historical accounts, being the differences in there is is the story to tell, really. Is that right?
Yeah, well, it's you know, we wanted to, it's very difficult to be a historian and be unbiased because we are unaware of our own biases. That's the problem. I am aware of the fact that I have to look for my biases, and I spend a lot of time doing it. A lot of the historians, like two of them at least, like, not accuse me, but they have implied, because they read the script of the film and they've been like, you know, they've been giving me a lot of consulting, and they've like implied that I'm pro Gracie, that I'm taking it way too easy on Carlos and Helio, and they were far less important than I'm making them sound. But again, that's where my interpretation comes in, and like, it does fall on me, and perhaps it's a lot of responsibility for someone. Even though I'm acquainted with the story, I am not a professional historian. Neither am I a filmmaker. But maybe because of these two things, maybe I'm well positioned to be the impartial person. Maybe because I'm half American, half Brazilian. I don't have a dog in this fight, you know, and I spend a lot of time self-reflecting, thinking about, like, am I being biased towards or for someone? And I don't think I am. We're really doing our best here to be like just how it is. Like, we want to talk about historical events that have nothing to do with fighting, but they're relevant. The Russo-Japanese War, Captain Commodore Perry's, pointing of the cannons at Edo in 1854 and forcing the shogun to open the ports to Western capitalism. Without that, would have Jigoro Kano developed judo? Probably not. Jigoro Kano is a product of the opening. Judo is a product of the opening of Western ideas into the East, into Japan. So that played a role. The rubber boom in Japan, in Brazil, in the Amazon. The rubber boom is very important. That's why Maeda went to Belém in the first place, right? The Japanese immigration. The role of Maeda. What is the role of Maeda? Why does everyone assume that he's the starting point of everything? What did he actually teach? Was he teaching that much? What is his actual role? To me, these are all important questions, and they're not clear. Like, what we get from the source is that he's practically retired in Brazil. So his role is very unclear. But the role, first, he has an experience in catch wrestling. The role of catch wrestling is very important in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And I can't back this up. I can't prove it, but it's my suspicion. In Brazil, till this day, they don't say chave de braço, which means arm bar, or jujigatame, which would be the Japanese terminology. They say armlock. When you knee bar someone, it's not chave de joelho, leg locking. The Kimura is also known as Americana. Now, if this is not the influence of catch wrestling, I don't know what is. But in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, they call leg locky, army locky, Americana. These are terms that came from catch wrestling, I'm convinced. You can't prove it. So the influence of catch wrestling, of the circus, to me, is undisputable. So the center of the approach focused on the Gracie family is, I think it's an injustice to history, and we're trying to correct that as best we can.
Yeah, that's fascinating what you're saying. I think the Americana can't be in any doubt, with Bob Anderson showing it and saying himself that he learned it from old folk style wrestlers in America, which came from catch wrestling. So I don't see how that can be disputed at all, really. And it's funny, I've been doing some research into Kazushi Sakuraba to put a video together for him, and I've kind of found, I guess, some of the things that you're mentioning is that I just wanted to focus on the techniques to explain how Kazushi Sakuraba was able to do what he did. But it's so much more than just the techniques, because to explain it properly, it's like you do have to talk about the globalization of the world, of how, a Japanese man is using techniques he learned from an Englishman to beat Brazilians. And it's just, there's so much more to the story than just arm bars and leg locks that I think you're trying to tell, right?
And you know that, you ever hear that, I think it's a Mark Twain quote that goes, how does it go? It goes, never let the truth get in the way of a good story, right? And so let's distort things to make it better. But in the case of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it's the opposite. The real story is much better than the one we had heard. The real story is something that has to do with nationalism. It has to do with politics in Brazil. It has to do with the rivalry between, the Brazilian nationalists and the Japanese immigrants. They're fiercely nationalistic. We're talking the 1930s and 40s here. Remember what was going on in the world in the 1930s and 40s. Where was Japan? Who was Japan? Japan is an aspiring superpower planning to cross the Pacific and colonize the Americas. We're not just talking Hawaii here. We're talking the Amazon. We're talking North. We're talking they were very ambitious people, right? They had plans. So imagine how the Japanese community felt about Brazilians who had appropriated their art, and now they're challenging us. Just imagine how they felt about it. Now, just as an example of the nationalism of Japanese nationalism in Brazil, unrelated to martial arts, but still a great side story. In the 1940s, after Hirohito surrenders, after the end of World War II, the Japanese were so fanatical about their emperor that when the Brazilian press or any Brazilian or any Japanese went around saying that Japan had surrendered, they considered that a piece of propaganda. They founded a terrorist group, and they would go around killing people that would dare say that the emperor had surrendered, because the emperor is God. And by definition, he can't surrender, right? Here's the best part. They did that with their samurai swords. Just to give it a level of the fanaticism of some of these Japanese nationalists, right? And they're in Brazil too. They're all over Brazil. So for them, watching Brazilians to challenge them in their art must have felt like a huge insult. So that rivalry to me is super interesting. That is way more interesting than Helio observing his brother while teaching class and then learning by osmosis. Who believes that? It's such a simplistic, I don't know. I when I look at the actual development of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu away from the official narrative, I think it's far more interesting, and it doesn't discredit anyone. It's just more rich. That's all it is.
Yeah, I'd agree with you on that about it being more rich, and that's the problem looking into the Sakuraba for me is I just wanted to start a video on, how he was using the Kimura or double wrist lock and, and then it's like, well, why was he the only one turning his back? And then all of a sudden you're down a rabbit hole of pro wrestling. Okay, he's a pro wrestler. Why do pro wrestlers turn their back? Oh, pro wrestling came from catch wrestling. How did catch wrestling turn into pro wrestling? Where did catch wrestling come from? And it's the simple fact of him having a habit of turning his back to look for that double wrist lock just goes so much deeper than just it was a move he chose.
No, there's a history. It's interesting. It's so ironic to me that the Japanese, through Sakuraba, have appropriated a Western style, right?
Right.
And then if you have a Brazilian representative in a gi,
yeah,
and then they're like going to Japan, using like a Japanese martial art. To me, that's so ironic.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite. This is probably like one of my favorite parts of the documentary. I love this story so much, and I've told it in like every podcast I've ever been on because it's such a great story.
Please.
We went Yuki Nakai in Tokyo. I wasn't sure what Yuki Nakai was going to say. Because he's a godfather of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in Japan. He's the president of the Japanese Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Federation, and I just love that. Japanese president of the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Federation, which is so ironic to me. But his interview was probably one of the best ones, if not the best one. And he just gave him some gems about like how Japanese perceive Brazilians. And because he's a judoka, Kosen Judo, fought Shuto, and then he had that clash with Hickson in 94, and later he loses an eye, falls in love with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, runs a school in Tokyo. But he told us that his reaction to, or the common Japanese reaction to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was three. The first one was surprise. It was like, who are these people? Why are they calling it Jiu-Jitsu? Why are they not calling it Judo? But they had no idea that there was a movement, in Brazil that resembled Kosen Judo. But that was their first reaction, was surprise. The second reaction, Yuki Nakai tells us, is it was respect and a little bit of fear. I think he used the word fear, if I'm not mistaken, because they're looking at guys like Hickson and Hoist, and they're going, these guys are really good. Like, how do these Brazilians get? So we had no idea that there were like all these Brazilians that are not from Judo officially, right? Indirectly they are, but like not directly under a Kodokan rule set. And they're really good, right? So there's like that element of fear. And then the third feeling, the third sentiment was one of nostalgia and sorrow for having lost something so valuable, because it's like, we had this, we created it. This is ours, and we lost it to Brazilians, and Brazilians had to revamp it, recycle it, and bring it back under the new terminology of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which they embrace humbly, right? They're not going, this is our art, it's Japanese Jiu-Jitsu or Japanese Judo, or it's Judo. They accept the term Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. They accept that Brazilians have essentially changed the name of their art, brought it back to Japan, and there's no ego there. They humbly accepted it. But the way it was, I mean, I don't speak Japanese, so I'm reading the translation, right? But you can see he was very sincere in that. And I thought it was such an admirable position for them to take, because they could make a much better claim. Because you see this idiotic debate about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, American Jiu-Jitsu, and I'm just listening to this. I'm like, you guys are stupid. But, and the people that could actually make a case for it aren't. Like, it's all Japanese. It's all Judo, But they could actually make a much stronger case for saying something like that, but they don't. They humbly accept Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So, these things to me, like, those are my favorite things about the documentary. It was so fun just being and part of this and being able to better understand our roots, and the influence of Brazilian culture and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I became aware of that during this trip. It had never dawned on me how much of Brazilian culture was in the sport. I'll give you an example. Still in Yuki Nakai's gym. We go to the Kosen Judo gym, right? In Tokyo University and Kyoto University. The black belts show up 30 minutes early, right? When have you ever seen that in a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu school? The black belts showing up 30 minutes early. Unless they're Aussie or American, maybe. The Brazilians definitely don't. No, like I'm half Brazilian, I can say it. Like we don't. We show up 5 minutes early. And that's like, count yourself lucky if I'm 5 minutes early. But they show up 30 minutes early and they're sweeping the mats all together, sweeping the mats. I have a video. It's perfect synchrony, absolutely beautiful to watch. I filmed them, recorded them, like sweeping the mats. Their gis are spotless white, nails trimmed. Their bow was 90 degrees, like 90-degree bow to us. And then we go to Yuki Nakai gyms where everyone was very respectful. I always say this: no one was this, but it was different. They were respectful in a Brazilian way. They showed up late. They sat down with their legs open, taping their fingers very calmly, laughing, chilling. The gis were not that clean. No one bowed 90 degrees. It was a handshake or a fist bump. And I'm looking at that and I'm going, that's not Japan. We're in Tokyo, but I'm not, these mats are not Japanese. They're more Brazilian than Japanese because that's how Brazilians are, sit with your legs wide open. If you show up late, no one cares. Fist bump, acai after workout. That's very Brazilian. It's very surf culture. And I think that Rio de Janeiro's surf culture permeated jiu-jitsu more than people realize. Even like some of the streetwear, like the jiu-jitsu wear is like very influenced by the surf culture, you know? And to me that it's like, it's not Japanese. It's something that we've appropriated from the Rio de Janeiro culture. So it's an area. So you go to Chechnya, you go to Dagestan, you go to Japan, you go to Canada, you name it. You go to Paraguay, you're going to find a Brazilian jiu-jitsu school and you see aspects of Brazilian culture inside the mats. So, or on the mats, sorry, Portuguese in my head. But, and this was very interesting for me to observe. Like to me, it was so much fun doing this. And, you know, I got to have a much better understanding of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and why things are the way they are, just, you know, being part of the production.
Yeah, I find that fascinating too, just the way that maybe these unconscious habits can be spread through, you know, the practice of a sport and how those influences can all be combined. And I mean, one of the things that did make me think about this, speaking of Yuki Nakai, was the, you know, all-time great Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu movie, Choke, with Rickson and the Vale Tudo tournaments. And when he heel hooks Gerard Gordeau in his first match, and that's the one where he loses his eye as well, which is amazing. But he heel hooks Gerard Gordeau, and I'm thinking, wait, he's not doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Where did he learn the heel hook from?
No, yeah, and you're right, and it's important to remember. You just mentioned something very important. That the Shuto has always existed. Shuto precedes the UFC by many, many years. So at the same time, we got to give Brazilians credit for creating the UFC, namely Rorion, Art Davey, and others. He didn't do it alone, but Rorion was a big part of it. Japanese never stopped. There was a tradition of fighting, of Shuto, that never really stops in Japan. It's pretty much MMA. It just never took off for some reason. I think it was missing some. Maybe it was the cage. Maybe it was Art Davey. Maybe it was the American pay-per-view. Maybe it was Dana White. But like it never really took off. But like this culture of fighting always existed in Japan, and Japan was not limited to judo. There was the Kosen schools never really died in Japan. They were just not as popular as the Olympic style. Judo as an Olympic style became so dominant around the world, not just Japan, that the techniques on the ground were all there. Just no one practiced them because there's no use of them in tournaments. There's not enough time on the ground for them to develop, except if you're doing Shuto or catch, you know. And that I think that there was this always. It's like Brazilians and Japanese. They meet again. You know, they met through Ono and Helio, or even before that with Omori and Carlos, and then Helio and Kimura. But later they're going to meet again, you know, but it's part of the same movement. The whole thing, it died for a long period of time. It was dead in the 70s, 80s, 90s. It revives, and we're reliving that moment that, you know, it's a momentum that began early in the 20th century. You know, so, and when I look at the fight world today, like I really see a continuation of something that started 100 years ago.
Yeah, and let's maybe go back to that 100 years ago point in time, because that's another thing with Judo that I was fascinated to find out, started by Satoru Sayama, who was as a wrestler as Tiger Mask, and wrestled all around the world, Mexico, Japan. Learned from Karl Gotch, who was a catch wrestler to start Judo. And in fact, the comic book or manga that Tiger Mask based his character off was in fact the inspiration for Kazushi Sakuraba to get into pro wrestling as a child. So he's reading the manga of Tiger Mask. That leads him to get into pro wrestling, which eventually led to his catch wrestling or MMA career. So I'm wondering if we can go back to that catch wrestling start in, back when it first began as a way for, bored English miners to place bets, and, which was developed before the establishment of the Judo Kodokan, and how things go from there.
I'm less familiar with the history of catch around the world, to be honest. Like, I am a little more familiar with the role it plays in Brazil, because that's really what I've studied and what I put my energy into. But there's no doubt that catch wrestling plays a role in the development of judo and martial arts in Japan, as you described. For some reason, it never really took off as a sport, and I wonder why that was. Because it did. Clearly, it's important. It has a tradition that much older than judo. In fact, there were catch wrestlers traveling the world way before judokas were doing it. So it's not like they weren't known around the world. And sometimes I wonder if the Japanese hierarchical system didn't play a role here. Like, much later, but the belts, the uniforms, whereas like the whole, like, even, but again, you have Western wrestling, which is a world sport. Like, everyone, it's everywhere. So I don't really know why catch wrestling they never started a federation. They missed a Kodokan. Like, Kodokan became the organization for judo, IBJJF or BJJ. I think catch never really had that, maybe, but it's a little unfair with the art, because they were very important, and like we described, like in Brazil, like their role is undeniable. George Gracie trained catch wrestling for a while. Even Helio cross-trained with the &Livre / catch wrestlers. Like, he prepared with them for one of his fights. So it's just that in Brazil, it later becomes &Livre, and it's catch. But &Livre is very influenced by Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It goes back and forth. It's just not one way. It's a two-way street. And as an example is the &Livre crowd in Brazil. Some gyms train in gi pants and they wear belts. Where do they get that from? Right? So it was an influence of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, or judo, really. But as far as the history of catch wrestling, man, I know it's a very rich history, but it doesn't fit in documentary. And we stop kind of where catch influences Brazil. We mention it briefly, and we move on because there's way too much to talk about in 90 minutes.
Sure.
That's the big problem, by the way.
I totally understand that problem you're having, because it does run so deep. So maybe if we skip forward then, just to bring us into the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu picture, is Maeda, and just linking it up with catch, when he was traveling the world as Conde Korma. Another part that blew my mind is to find out that he actually competed in the World Catch Wrestling Championships in London in like 1900 something or other. And there's that picture of him doing the, in the tights, doing the hammerlock and, half Nelson. And when I saw those, I'm like, what is this? So how did that all play out?
So Maeda, few interesting things on Maeda. There's if you go on Pedreira's site, GTR, Global Training Report, and if you type in like Global Training Report, top 20 myths about Maeda. It's very interesting. It's a must read. Very, very, because it kind of demystifies a lot of the things that we know or we think we know about Maeda. But from my understanding, and we even had some stories about people who knew Maeda and Belém do Pará in the Amazon. And he was a fairly known character, and the stories that circulated about him made me like him even more. Not because he was a master Miyagi, because he really came across as a normal person. And that's why I like him even more now. Because I've always been suspicious of like the heroic type. You put him on a pedestal, and this guy is really different. This guy is special. Yeah, he was heroic in some way. And then when you meet him, you're always disappointed. You're always disappointed when you meet your heroes. Because when you meet them, you see they're human, and then you're always disappointed. And I've been disappointed every single time I met someone who I admired, because I saw that they were human.
Yeah.
They were not superheroes. And now I like them more. I've evolved past that worshipping phase of my life. You know, I like you even more now. But Maeda apparently liked to gamble. And he was a womanizer. And he loved to drink. And he liked to dress nicely. And when people that knew him, described him, it was like, man, what a normal person. He just went to Brazil trying to make money. And he had his moment on the stage in London, like you're describing. It was 1908, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that sounds right.
And he had his moment there, man. He liked the crowd, and he liked the reporters, and he probably had groupies. And was it really that different from a UFC fighter today? And I don't know, maybe he talked some trash. Maybe he didn't. I don't know how good his English was, but from all accounts, it wasn't very good. But, you know, it's interesting to me, like when you see these characters that we put on pedestal, we frame them on the wall and they become godlike, to see them with a normal face and a normal demeanor. I like them even more. And, you know, Maeda, I think that he was just enjoying imagine how many places Maeda went to. He was all over Europe, like Spain, England. He went to the United States, Mexico, Cuba, all through South America, ends up in the Amazon. This man came from Japan in the early 20th century, early 1900s. It's like, for us, it's like the equivalent of going to Mars or something, you know, and look at the experience this man had. He was enjoying his life. He was living his life to the fullest. So to me, I think martial arts, even though he certainly was passionate about it, it was a vehicle for him to be normal. He just wanted to travel the world, make his money, and have a good time. He reaches his 40s and he settles in the Amazon, gets married, has a couple kids, boom. Like, what's more normal than that? Like, he lived his life, man. He lived it with intensity. Traveling the world like that today is already, like, very ambitious and unusual. 100 years ago, man, it's a dream come true. Like, it's not even how many people in that era can say that. So when you put things in perspective like that, I think that he was not a missionary of judo. I think he was just like, hey, man, I'll make it any way I can. And when he got older, he moved away from fighting. He became a diplomat. Okay. You know, he was an ambassador for Japanese immigrants in the Amazon, which is like a whole side story that's like really interesting too. But I fell in love with the character, like, even more than, not because he's a superhero, but because he was so normal. That's why I like George Gracie, by the way, because George was so normal. From all accounts, same thing. Womanizer. He'd drink a beer after fights with his friends. He was a normal guy. He was just, you know, enjoying his life. And I suspect that when Carlos presented the Gracie diet, it's not really Gracie diet. It's from an Argentinian nutritionist, but that's a different story too. But I suspect that George went like, get out of here, man. I'm not going to eat oranges all day. That's stupid. No, I'm going to eat meat like everyone else. I'll eat whatever I want. Like, that's stupid. You know, and Carlos was like, no, this is how you have to eat. And George, to me, my guess is he would have been like, get out of here with that crazy diet, you know. And every person who described him as a rebel, which makes me like him even more because he seems so normal, you know. And I think that's what came across. The history of Jiu-Jitsu is a very normal history, even though it's very rich. It's very normal in the sense where its characters are not different from the same people you know in their everyday life. You know someone like George Gracie, and you know someone like Carlos, and you know someone like Helio, and you know someone like, you know immigrants that are struggling to make money. You know an immigrant out there that will do just about anything to get paid. Why would we think the Japanese were any different? They were not these noble missionaries. They were hustlers. I'll work in a sugarcane field. I'll work in a coffee plantation. Oh, you want me to teach judo? Even better.
Yeah, for me, I've always found that idea of them traveling around the world to, you know, challenge different martial arts styles and going by boat. That just to think that they must have, you know, been sitting there for ages thinking about, you know, what they, you know, okay, I'm going to go to this place and ask people to fight. There's something just romantic about that I just read about, and it, you know, it draws me into like, that must have been a wild adventure.
So, you know, there's a Brazilian director called José Padilha. He was a director of Narcos and RoboCop. You might have heard of him. He's big with Netflix now, and he's doing a film on Rickson Gracie. And originally, I think the film is more focused on Rickson now. Originally, it was about Maeda, Helio, Rickson. He was going to tell more of like the history of BJJ. I actually spoke to him on the phone a couple years ago because it's around the same time we started working on our project, and I'm trying to convince him to do something different. I'm like, man, if you're going to do a film, let's do something. Let's move away from that Rocky Balboa, you know. It's how many times have we seen that film, the hero type? How many times have we seen that? I wanted to write a story about nationalism, the rivalry between Brazilians and Japanese, which I thought was way more interesting than just that Rocky Balboa, the superhero type. You know, like we've seen that movie so many times. I mean, the recipe works itself, but he wasn't too interested in something that was atypical. He wanted just watch his films. You get the stereotypical superheroes, and he's a good director, but his story will be very, very inaccurate. Like whatever comes, I can almost guarantee you. Like this guy, I offer not even for myself, I could put him in contact with other historians that could help him so he doesn't make any mistakes. But he seemed to be adamant about telling what he thought was the truth and not really what was historically verifiable. So I can almost guarantee it's going to be very inaccurate.
Well, that was, also then one of the things that made me, I don't know however you want to put it, but the classic Rickson 400-0 record, which the first time I heard it, I was like, wow, that's the most incredible thing I've ever heard. And now I'm looking back going, I can't believe I ever really believed 400-0. Like, come on, it's an absurd claim used for marketing. And I mean, I wonder, those kind of marketing things.
No, you're right. Like I was just going to say, it's important. The marketing was important, but that's what it is. Like you can't, I'm the same as you. The first time I heard that, I'm like, oh my God, this guy can walk on water, and then later you start learning more about fighting and then you get deeply involved in BJJ. I'm like, man, that's like a child's tale, man. Like, how can you even, and don't get me wrong. There are people that have records like that. They're very, and he certainly had a very impressive record for his time, but the whole pedestal thing is you don't have to dig too deep to find out that it just doesn't stand. It just doesn't hold. Like you can't. But I mean, no doubt he was an important character.
No doubt, of course. All the usual caveats. He can stand on the work that we do have on video footage, and he's very important to the role. But I mean, let's be real. So I mean, the other parts that there are some probably disputes in then that is when Maeda actually gets to Brazil and actually starts teaching it, teaching the art, whatever it is you want to say he's actually teaching to people, who was actually there learning it and who he actually taught. So how did that all start to play out?
So the traditional narrative goes, Maeda gets to Brazil and he's fighting in the circus. Gastão Gracie Sr., Carlos's father, was a circus owner and a fight manager. And that's all true. So there very likely was a connection. I mean, we can't prove it. Like it's very likely that there's a lot of truth to that because they were in the same scene. Like one's a circus owner and fight manager, the one's a fighter fighting in the circus, right? Same place. So ironically, the very first time Gracie is in contact with Jiu-Jitsu, he's managing wrestlers against Jiu-Jitsu, the Japanese. So they're actually working against Jiu-Jitsu. And the Japanese are complaining that the wrestlers had too much oil on their body, so they couldn't really grapple with them. And then I just thought, I was like, that's like the first time Gracie is in contact with Jiu-Jitsu, is working against it, really. But Maeda settles there, and he teaches. There are 5 Brazilians that are in the forefront of as Maeda's students, and it's very obvious because they're repeatedly referenced in the press. Over and over and over, you see Maeda being associated with these 5 Brazilians. And Jacinto Ferro was the most prominent one. Dr. Matheus Pereira, Valdemar Gomes, Rafael Lopes, and Guilherme de la Roque. These 5 Brazilians. And very likely they were promoted. We're not sure to what rank. That seems to be, it's either the last Q, which will be today the equivalent of a brown belt, or Shodan, which is first degree black. But in Judo, they don't go black and then first degree. They go straight to first degree, right? That's where they start their black belt. So given how long they had been training under Maeda, approximately 5 years, and given that Kodokan would have promoted someone around that period of time, it's very likely that Maeda promoted them to black belt, except that the reporter does not understand the language. At the time, early in the 20th century, black belt meant nothing. So he just promotes them to first rank. So that's the best I can translate. Promoting the 5 to first rank. First rank of what? The reporter didn't think it relevant enough to mention. He probably didn't understand the difference anyway. But very likely black belt, right? And And then when you see all this and you see these 5 Brazilians being consistently mentioned in the press, at one point Maeda's tired of fighting. He's still known, so he's getting challenged. And he just goes, I'm too old. I don't want to fight. Fight one of my students. Pick one of the 5 here. You can fight one of them. Right? And nowhere in there is Carlos Gracie mentioned. That's the real problem. Because how can he be the favorite if he's never mentioned? You know, he was too young. You got to remember, he's a teenager at this time. So it's highly unlikely that he's the most prominent figure in a place where, like, you have all these known athletes with fight experience, and he's a teenager, and he's the boss in the gym when Maeda's not around. Kayla implies that, right, in her biography. So, you know, you become a little suspicious of how much Carlos actually trained there. There is an article of 1922, if I'm not mistaken, that mentions a man called Oscar Gracie fighting Donato Pires dos Reis. And so Oscar is very likely, you know, an error by the journalist, common at the time, you know, probably Carlos, maybe Osvaldo, a little too young perhaps, but very likely Carlos Gracie. And what's interesting about this article is that they're both referenced as students of Jacinto Ferro, not of Maeda, even though Maeda is present at the event. So whatever little evidence we have at this time suggests that, in fact, Carlos was trained under Jacinto Ferro and not Maeda directly, because Maeda he's moved away from that position of teaching at that point. Even though it's possible that Carlos had some experience with Maeda, this is the one thing that every historian agrees on. That relationship is exaggerated. It's the degree of how exaggerated it is that people disagree on.
Yeah, okay. And I guess even just saying that relationship is exaggerated is such a diversion from what is commonly accepted as as what happened, that it raises a lot of questions or a lot of interest in and of itself. And that Donato Perez, his story, I may be getting my stories mixed up, so you'll be able to correct me. I had thought that I'd heard that maybe his involvement with Carlos Gracie was more important, or at the time he claimed it did, and there was an argument over that at the time. Is that?
Donato is very important because he gives Carlos his first job teaching Jiu-Jitsu. So Donato is the one who's in a challenge with Oscar Gracie. It's the same person. In 1928, right, they will meet again in Belo Horizonte, Minas Gerais, right, which is close to Rio. And Donato is the head instructor for the police there. He hires Carlos as his assistant. So he gives Carlos Gracie his first job teaching Jiu-Jitsu. Later, 2 years later, Carlos has a brief experience in São Paulo where he actually opens the first Gracie Academy. The first Gracie Academy was opened in São Paulo in 1929 or 1930. I can't remember now. But it was open for a few months. It didn't do well. I mean, you're talking about going against the best Japanese in the country were living in São Paulo at that time. Like, Carlos had some tough competition. He didn't survive. He moves to Rio, where he opens a school under Donato. Donato is the head instructor in 1930 of the Jiu-Jitsu Academy, was called. Carlos Gracie and George Gracie are assistant instructors, meaning they were there, but there's clearly a hierarchy as to who was the main, who's the boss, like who was the instructor there, right? Carlos is under him. So right away you see a hierarchy. And the academy, by the way, it was not called the Gracie Academy. It's called the Jiu-Jitsu Academy. The founder was Donato in 1930. There's no Gracie Academy in 1925. So they have to fix that patch. And this is not controversial. There's nothing that points to a Gracie Academy in 1925. 1930 is where it's at, and it's founded by Donato. He later leaves. He has a fallout with the Gracie brothers. They attack him at the Hotel America, or Donato claims so, at least, that he was attacked by the brothers. And then he's a tax collector. He doesn't need the money. He goes on with his life, and he just leaves the gym, and Carlos takes over. And from then onwards, it becomes the Gracie Academy. But it was only after this fallout. He would later, I believe in 1936, it might have been I can't remember exactly the year, but he's going to open an academy in São Paulo with George Gracie. So he doesn't really disappear from the scene. And he has a much better relationship with George, who was enemies with Carlos and Helio at this time. But he's a very important character because he actually claimed to have a diploma from Konjikoma, from Maeda. We never saw the diploma. There's at least one reporter who confirmed seeing a diploma, but we don't know of what, right? But he claimed to have a certificate, which at that time was more valuable than a black belt, really. That's all that people cared about was a diploma. He also claimed that Carlos never met Maeda, which is very interesting because the only eyewitness only person who comment on this period, other than Carlos Gracie himself, is Donato, because he's from Belém do Pará. He was a student of Jacinto Ferro, and he categorically says that Carlos never met Maeda. Now, this is at a time where he's enemies with Carlos. So whether he was just saying that to attack Carlos or because he was really telling the truth, we're never going to know. My personal suspicion is that Donato is not the most reliable of characters. Okay. He was a political actor like everyone else. But the only eyewitness at the time, other than Carlos himself, to comment on this relationship is Donato, and he very emphatically says that they never even met.
Okay, so that's interesting that that's possibly how it went down. So is Donato Perez, when he's making those claims, is that after he was attacked, or was that before he was attacked? Was that
the problem? Here's the case for Carlos here. If he knew nothing about jiu-jitsu, why did he invite him to be an assistant instructor, both in Minas Gerais and Rio de Janeiro? If he didn't know any jiu-jitsu, why would you invite a guy who doesn't know any jiu-jitsu to teach next to you? All right, why would you do it? It makes no sense. Once he's on bad terms with Carlos, that's when he goes around saying like he never met Carlos or Maeda, right? So you can see that there's a political rivalry there as well, and that might have impacted the choice of words. But at the same time, his testimony is at least as valuable as Carlos. At the very, very least, it's just as valuable. He was there. We know for a fact that he was a student of Jacinto Ferro. We know that he outranked Carlos because both times they're interacting, Donato is in a higher position, a position of authority over Carlos, which suggests that Carlos was learning from him as well, given that hierarchy, right? So Carlos probably learned from him. A lot of historians, or like a lot of researchers in Brazil, they claim that ģeomorí might have been the source for a lot of their knowledge through George Gracie. ģeomorí have a good relationship with George. George was actually the one teaching the brothers, Carlos and Helio, because he was better than, during the beginning at least, he was better than Helio, he was better than Carlos. And so ģeomorí might have been a source of their knowledge as well. But anyway, what everyone agrees on, and this is that the relationship, the apprenticeship of Carlos under Maeda is grossly exaggerated. That seems to be unanimous. No one really argues with that.
Okay, so that's pretty believable that he could be exaggerating his story, or that's just wrong. That if he's invited him to be a jiu-jitsu instructor, then he must have some experience. Obviously, that would make sense. And then after he gets attacked by them, he claims, "Oh no, he didn't know a thing." I can see how that could play out.
So the order of events is instructive here, right? So, but anyway, the story is interesting. And either way, one way or another, the role of Carlos is undeniable. It's just that his role was not a technical one. And that's what people get mad at them. Oh, you're supposed to revolutionize the art. And then I go, this is where my challenge comes. Watch them do positions. Watch the videos of the 1950s, 60s. Does it look very sophisticated? What's different from what the Japanese were doing? It's less sophisticated. It's not more. So what did you revolutionize? This is what I keep asking. Show me the technical evolution that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. It's inferior to the Japanese. It's not superior. So if anything, they were a notch below technically, not above. And this is very clear about how adamant they were about tweaking the rules to their favor, fighting with shorter gis. They didn't want to fight the Japanese with long gis. That was a huge issue. The gi thing kept coming up over and over and over. They did not want to fight with long gis. They wanted short sleeves. Marcial Serrano, one of the Brazilian historians, he goes, the Gracies were more Japanese than the Japanese. Because the Japanese would take their gis off the fight. ģeomorí go, no gi, let's go.
Yeah.
Point, okay. No points, okay. Different weight class, no problem. Let's go. And then Carlos and Helio more like traditional. It has to be in the gi. The sleeves have to be short. Has to be no points. Longer fights. They're very specific about how they wanted to fight. And George was different. That's why George was less picky. Even though most of George's fights were probably fake too. He admitted to that, by the way. He admitted to most of his fights being fake. But he was the kind of guy you want to fight? Let's go. What rule set? Don't care. Let's go.
Just to bring up, in doing my research for this interview, for the first time I saw looked like it was from a Kosen Judo textbook of someone doing pretty much looks like rubber guard in there. And it was the first time I saw that, and I was like, wow, I might have to look into that a bit more, but just on the surface, that's what it looked like. And it's going then into rule sets. One of the stories that really highlighted that for me was the story of Rufino dos Santos, and he's trying to arrange a match with, I think it was Carlos.
So Rufino is interesting because he's a catch wrestler. He's the instructor of gymnastics at the YMCA in Rio de Janeiro. And he ends up fighting with Carlos, and the match was a bit complex. It was controversial in the sense where apparently Rufino was in a ring. They're going out of bounds with the ropes. Carlos catches a choke. The ref tells him to stop. Carlos keeps choking. They're out of bounds. Rufino apparently taps. Rufino claims because the ref said to stop and you're choking me, right? And then Carlos says, I won. The referee demands that Carlos continues fighting, sides with Rufino. Carlos says, he tapped, I'm not fighting again. And then he goes, if you don't step on the mat to continue the fight, we're going to disqualify you. I'm going to give the fight to Rufino dos Santos. So that's what happens. Carlos refuses to continue fighting. Rufino is declared the winner. The trash talking back and forth in the press keeps going. It gets so extreme that it gets to the point where Rufino dos Santos is attacked outside the Tijuca Tênis Clube. If you're an old school jiu-jitsu person, you know exactly what I'm talking about, because Tijuca Tênis Clube is where the world championships were held in Rio de Janeiro. So just outside that arena. But so they attack him. Helio claims that he attacked him alone. Rufino dos Santos claimed that it was all the Gracie brothers, Osvaldo, George, Helio, and Carlos. One of them remained in the car. I think Osvaldo stayed in the car, and the other three attacked him together. And it's interesting because that's the first time that's happened. They've been accused of that 3 times with Baldi, with Manuel Rufino dos Santos, and Donato Pires dos Reis. Donato Pires does accuse them of attacking them, the Gracie brothers attacking them outside his hotel where he lived, Hotel America, where he lived. But this time with Rufino dos Santos, they're actually arrested. They're sentenced to prison, 2.5 years sentenced to prison. Brazil at the time was a dictatorship. It was under Getúlio Vargas. It was a very controversial figure in Brazilian history. But Vargas was a Brazilian strongman, at the time, and whatever he said was law. One of the Gracie students was this woman. I don't remember her name, but she held a role inside his office. I don't know if she was his secretary. I can't remember what her role was, but she knew Getúlio Vargas, the dictator at the time, very well. And she, through her connections, managed to get a pardon from Getúlio Vargas to the Gracie brothers. So they were convicted, and later they are, let free. So they weren't really, they never served time. But this really did a lot of damage to them because they were really hustling to get a job at the Navy. Like, they wanted to work with the military so they have a guaranteed salary. And after this, they kind of leaves them with a really bad rep in the press in Rio de Janeiro. So the Navy hires Takeo Yano instead. And, it was not such a noble period there for the Gracie brothers. You could see that if you're accused of the same thing 3 times, what are the odds that everyone is 3 independent sources all saying the same thing, And it's interesting that they're all accusing him of using what they call box de ferro. Now, it's difficult to translate because it's not a box, and ferro means steel. No one goes to a fight with a steel box, but it's very likely brass knuckles. Now, because box, I'm going to box you with steel. So that might have been what the reporters were referring to, brass knuckles at the time. So they were accused of using brass knuckles in the attack, and it's certainly not the most noble aspect of their history. But again, before people judge them too, you got to remember, we've all had our. I'm not saying that's right. I'm not saying I would have done that, but you got to be careful not to be the other side too. Oh, they're horrible, and I don't think that's admirable. But that doesn't diminish their role in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. That's why we don't talk about it in the film, because, okay, they attacked Manuel Rufino dos Santos and then they beat him up. Does that change their role in BJJ? No. Does that make them angels? No, they were not angels. If that's the answer you're looking for, they're far from angels. But, their role is still there. That doesn't change. If I made a documentary about Helio and Carlos, I would mention these things, but I don't. I'm making a documentary about Jiu-Jitsu. we're not going to get into their personal life, which is a whole different. That's a whole another story, man. And they're very interesting people. There's no doubt about that. You can read Helio's biography, and that just the whole time is like, man, it's a very unique family, and good and bad, like any other family. I have a job because of them, but
yeah,
things are less admirable. Like I can't see myself attacking someone down the street with brass knuckles with my brothers. I don't, unless they try to rape my daughter or something like extreme like that. No circumstance that can warrant something like that,
Yeah, I think part of that story of the implication of a metal instrument, possibly brass knuckles, and the conviction, that might happen. I think part of it is that we might have that idolized myth of putting their photo on the wall as some kind of, you have that higher opinion, and then that kind of brings it down back to earth in such a startling way that it wasn't just a bad, I don't know what you could even describe it as. Let's just say attacking someone with brass knuckles is a pretty extreme form of revenge for people who you might assume are the noble image of martial artists.
Yeah, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, but again, it just reinforces what I was saying earlier. People are people. We all lie. We're all messed up. We're not angels. We're not demons. We vary, and only to the degree in which we lie and we deceive, to the degree in which we're honest and dishonest. That's where we vary. But who can say that they're always honest? Who can say that they're always doing the right thing? Who can say that they never lie? The history of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu comes with the good and bad. But here we are,
Yeah.
And Robson Gracie is another one of my favorite interviews. Very, very charismatic. Renzo Gracie's father, very charismatic and fun guy to hang out with too. And he said something like that, and I can't remember the exact words. And he says, for good and better, for worse, here we are. And I think he summarized the history of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu with those few words, because for better, for worse, the good and the bad. The good and the bad got us here. You are who you are because of the bad decisions you've made and because of the good decisions, the right decisions. We're not the product of only the good or the bad. We're product of everything. And why should the history of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu be any different? The history of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is the product of some hideous acts, but it's also the product of the stubbornness and egomania, and it's the product of some very brave moments, and it's a product of a lot of marketing and the ambition to carve a niche outside of judo, and they do that. And you got to give them credit, because I much prefer BJJ over judo. I don't dislike judo, but I think BJJ is far more interesting. I'm biased. This is what I've been doing my whole life, but if it weren't for them, we wouldn't have this. We wouldn't have Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. We have Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu because they put their foots down and disagreed with the Japanese on the rule set. What else are you going to say? So
yeah,
it's both good and bad.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with you on that. I mean, the fact that there's going to be the good, the bad, maybe the truth somewhere in the middle, maybe the ugly tacked on the end as well. That's not just the story of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. That's the story of life, of the world. Every story you tell is going to do that. And the idea that you could fit it all in a 90-minute documentary, that's,
And that's where we're struggling, because we have changed the script more times than I can count. And it's hard. What do we leave out? There's so many great segments that we're going to leave out. So many. What are you going to do? We have enough material for 12 episodes. But unless someone gives us $1 million to produce 12 episodes, we can't do it. We need 12 episodes. We need $1 million. If someone's willing to give us $1 million, we'll produce 12 episodes.
Yep.
But
that's the pitch there for the.
Hey, if someone rich out there that really loves history, DM me. We can make this happen. But for what we have, we've done a lot. I think we've managed to do something really. I think we've done okay. I'm happy with what's coming out of this, because we had to tell 100+ years of history, so many events, so many characters, so many outside influences. You can't correct history without without talking about what's wrong about it. So first you got to tell what is wrong about history before you can correct it. If you just correct it, it's out of context. So again, how do you do that in 90 minutes? It's very, very hard.
Yeah, I'm kind of the opinion now that everyone should have the experience making a documentary like that, so they can understand when they watch a documentary how, you know, maybe there's more to the story, how things could be portrayed, and how much choice is in the hands of the person making the film, what they put in, what they leave out, and what their limits are, just so they can get more of an idea of the process. And I mean, one of the things I don't want to leave out of this interview is the story of George Gracie. I mean, you've touched on him a bit. You've said he's one of your favorites, and I wonder if we can just go into that a bit more, you know, and his development.
No, absolutely. So it's interesting because I heard of George since I was a white belt. The first time I heard of George Gracie, and I'll tell you why. My first instructor in Brazil, his father was a student of the Ono brothers and of George Gracie. So that was the first time I'd heard of George, but you just didn't hear of him outside of that first time I heard of him as a white belt. I never heard of him after that. I'm like, why? And then when I started reading more about the history of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and that's what George had coming up all the time, George Gracie all the time. And he was the first hero of the Gracie family. Like when Helio was still a swimmer, he was still rowing. He was not a fragile individual. He was an elite athlete. That's another myth that we're going to, try to correct. The whole thing of him being weak was a marketing exploit. And it was brilliant. And it goes back to the Russo-Japanese War, small defeating the large, you see. But, he was a successful swimmer. But George was the first hero of the family. And he just had a very different personality from Carlos and Helio. And like I said, he seemed like a very normal guy and didn't follow the rules and kind of did what he wanted to do. And there's probably some disputes over fight purses, like, no speculation, but it's the one thing that everyone fights over is for money. Brothers, family, money, working together. That's got to get complicated, right? But George was interesting to me because many of his fights were fake. But one of my favorite episodes about George is when he admitted, he went to the press in the 1940s and he basically goes, by the way, all these fights you guys are watching and applauding, they're all fake. And I'm like, what? All fake? I'm like, yeah, most of them are fake. Yours too? Like, yeah, mine were fake too. And then I thought, he harmed himself. Like, why would he do that? Like, there was a certain degree of honesty there to be able to say something that hurts you and your cause, right? And then a reporter goes, but all of them are fake? And then George goes, no, not all of them. My brother Helio, he never fought a fake fight in his life. And this is at a time when they were enemies. They were not on good terms. George and Helio almost fought a few times. They almost went at it, like in the public, like they were not on good terms. So instead they had their students fight for them. George would pitch his students against Helio's students, and that's how they fought. But for George at that time, when they were not on good terms, to praise his brother as the only person who never had a fake match, who does that? Who puts their enemies up and you put himself down in order to put his enemy up? Like how many people? It takes a certain degree of honesty, and that's why he's not remembered. I'm convinced he didn't have the ambition to be remembered. He's a normal person. He's like, I don't have to have a legacy and be remembered in history. I can just be me and enjoy my life, and I don't want to have 21 kids. And he's such a normal guy. But he could be called the very least, one of the founding fathers of modern MMA. Why? Because what you could call the first Vale Tudo fight, Vale Tudo is what we used to call MMA back in the day. At that time, it was Valendo Tudo, a little bit different. But his fight with Chico Soledade was Vale Tudo in the 90s sense of the word. Like headbutts, no gloves, elbows, both of them in Speedos. You do whatever you want to do. I'll do whatever I want to do. Let's go at it. And George wins the fight. It's arguably the first, modern version of Vale Tudo, even far more brutal than the UFC. Headbutts, it was, the rules weren't very, I'm not sure about groin shots. I'm not sure about that, but I think groin shots might have been legal as well. But he plays that role, man. And he had a great relationship with the Japanese, and he had a great relationship with the catch wrestlers, and everyone loved him. And from all accounts, he was funny, charismatic, and that's why he's not remembered. Because history remembers who? History remembers the hustlers. It remembers that people are pushing to have a flawless record of 400-0.
Right.
Because, like I said, I'm serious. Like if Rickson had fought in Abu Dhabi in 2001, 2003, you think he would have won? Or 99 for that matter. You think I won? I don't think he would have won. I don't think he would have beaten Zemar Sperry. I don't think he would have beaten those guys. So it's, what do? You conserve, crystallize that moment where, I'm 400-0 and you stick to that and you pick your fights. And it's nothing new. It was an old marketing scheme that was way back into the 30s. Pick your fights, pick the rule set, pick everything, and then make everything work in your favor, and then win. And then you market the hell out of that as the most important fight in history. If you draw, you didn't lose because you didn't get tapped. And if you lose, it's a moral victory because your opponent is heavier. You can't lose.
Yeah.
When you lose, you can't lose. You never admit defeat. Everything is a victory, right? And it's brilliant marketing, and it works. It still works. I had people argue with me about the 400 fights, and they get mad. It's almost like a religion. And I'm like, man, and then you start thinking, okay, I can see how, dogma takes place. I can see where it begins. Had some of these, had Rickson been born, 800 years ago, and we were still talking about him, he would have superpowers. He'd be flying.
Yeah.
He'd be doing, he'd be doing arm bars with the power of his mind. And it gets blown so out of proportion when people just are so adamant about conserving that aura of invincibility. And it's just so inhuman. It's so supernatural. And I look at it, I'm like, who believes this? And that's why I love the story of Maeda gambling. Yeah. I love George Dixie, the womanizer, because he's normal. He's not a saint.
Yeah. I guess that's probably part of the thing that interests me, especially with this sport. There seems to be, all this art. There seems to be that, that aura about the founders where, in other sports, it wouldn't even be debatable that the people coming up now are better than people of the past. Maybe it's easier with running. You've got, a set time, but in every other sport, it's a given that improvements have been made and the people of the past were the best at their time. And, you could say that if they were born now, they would be the best now. They had that natural gift, or you can make that argument. But the fact that it's even controversial even to say that is part that I understand it, I guess, but I just feel that it just shouldn't really cause any tension.
It's fundamentalism. It's just not, on a religious form, but quasi-religious. You're absolutely right. You can measure swimming. You're going to put an Olympic gold medalist from the 80s in the pool with Michael Phelps. What do you think is going to happen? Is that an insult to the swimmer of the 1980s that Michael Phelps outswam him? Why would you be offended? Why? Swimming improved. Do you love swimming? Yes, I love swimming. Do you want swimming to improve as a sport? Yes, I do. So why are you upset that, people and today are beating people, have better times than people in the 90s? Why do how arrogant are you to crystallize that moment in history and act like, oh no, the jiu-jitsu that I did in my prime was the best one? It would be like me saying the jiu-jitsu in 2007 when I went at ECC was the best jiu-jitsu. There's nothing better than that. And I'm like, no. Jiu-jitsu in 2007 was better. And I just want to keep saying that for the rest of my life. How arrogant am I? If you love the art, you want it to evolve. And I am proud of the fact that my purple belt's going to be beating me very soon. Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with that. So what? If you want the art to evolve, don't you? Are we such egomaniacs that I have to be the superhero for the rest of my life? I can't lose. I can't be, I can't accept the fact that the techniques evolve and then the new generations are better, and I can't pass on the torch, acknowledging that they are standing on the shoulders of giants, because I am standing on the shoulders of giants, and the giants of the past are Hicks and Gracie. He's one of them. Our Holes, Gracie, and Carlson, and Helio. Why can I accept that I am here because of them? And without them, I would not have a job. Now, whether the young generation wants to acknowledge of that speaks to their intelligence. Because if you have half a brain, you have to acknowledge these giants of the past. But to say that they are better grapplers than the young generation is delusional. You put the best grappler in the 1980s with Paulo Miao, and Paulo Miao would be on his back in seconds. So what? It's a compliment to jiu-jitsu. It's not a compliment to Paulo Miao. It's not an insult to Rickson Gracie. It's a compliment to the beautiful art of jiu-jitsu that we all love so much.
Yeah, I hear you. And like, it was funny you mentioned purple belts, because I've even had that thought myself, rolling around. I'm like, damn, these purple belts are getting good, man. They're getting good, and like, yeah, they're going to get me. They're going to get me, and they should, that's if the sport's evolving and it's evolving and they're not being held back at all. I'm getting older. They're younger. What they're gonna catch up and go past us. It's just a fact of life.
And that's a good thing. It really is. I insist on that. I think the young generation makes it hard sometimes. You get the purple belt with his shoyo rogi, watches a lot of YouTube videos, subscribes to every BJJ Academy out there. It's like, yeah, old man, I got it. I know more jiu-jitsu. And you're like, you don't have shit. You had it all digested and you were spoon-fed that. You didn't come up with any of it. You're an idiot if you give yourself credit over things you didn't do. It drives me crazy when you get these 22-year-old purple belts. Like, nah, I got it. What do you got? You're spoon-fed. You didn't do anything. What did you actually develop? Go. You memorize something on YouTube. Don't act like you're all wise and knowledgeable. You're not. That's called memory.
Yeah.
And it's not impressive. But I think it's almost like it's cute in a condescending way when you get these purple belts and brown belts that are yeah, I know, I got it. I'm like, man, you just wait. Because I used to think that way too. I was that guy. I was that annoying blue belt who thought he knew it all. I knew 3 half-guard sweeps, and I thought my jiu-jitsu was so sophisticated, and you have to go through that. I think you only learn these things when you go through their phases, right? You have to experience that arrogance of youth to be able to become a wiser person as you get older. And you look back and you go oh man, it's embarrassing. It really is. But it's just part of the journey, And
yeah.
I think that a lot of the, sometimes you listen to people like Gordon Ryan be so full of themselves, and then you're like, man, I can't wait for him to retract every single thing he's saying and apologize to everyone, because he will. By the time he hits 40, he's going to, man, what an ass I was, unless he's that crazy. But, I think if he's got half a brain, he's going to go, man, what an ass I was. I was a total idiot, really bragging about other people's accomplishments. I was treading a road that was built by other people. I was walking a road that was built by hundreds and thousands of other people that came before me, and I never acknowledged it, and I never said thank you.
Yeah, I think it's such a huge point there where, you just hope that people don't get arrogant. You can just hope that people don't get, people don't take it in a negative direction. And then I guess the choice comes up to you if you're going to, how are you just going to let that happen? Or could would you start thinking that, well, maybe if I do create some idols and some mythology, that can prevent it, because they can never touch the mythology that we create, because that's set in stone. So that's going to keep them in their place, because there's this thing they can't challenge ever. Whereas are you just going to be like, okay, let's roll. If you get us fair and square, and that it is what it is.
The mythology, we crave, and we start to film with that. That's one of our opening lines. We crave mythology, right? To me, it's a glitch in human psyche. It's a flaw. It's if there's something we needed to fix, and we can't. We have a leaning towards a mythology. I'll give you an example. If I hid behind my black belt and my accomplishments, I could literally cruise the rest of my life, and no one would suspect that the Robert Drysdale of 2020 is not the same Robert Drysdale of 2008-9. I could literally surf that way for the rest of my life. No one would question me. But I don't do that. I throw myself on the mats, which to me is an act of bravery, because I'm not as healthy and I'm not as athletic. But I'll throw myself on the mats and I'll train with my younger students that are in their prime, and they're giving me hell. And the white belt looks at that. What? Robert is not invincible? What? He just had a brown belt pass his guard? I am no longer on a pedestal. Therefore, I'm nowhere. It's like you. The way they look at you is not. They don't think more of you. They think less. They should think more, because it takes a lot of courage to step on the mats when you're beat up. As I think it does. I admire people that are still competing. I'm like, man, he's a superhero. I really think Megaton is a superhero. He's 50 and he's still competing with the adults. I can't imagine how beat up is that guy is, and he's still doing it, right? But the way people see it is they see it as a sign of weakness instead of seeing it as a sign of strength. And, I think that someone who's mature enough will see the opposite. And like, I have to force myself on the mat sometimes. So I understand, where some of these guys are coming from and why they want to crystallize that moment of the past and make that the whole story. Because it's too hard to admit that you're going to lose to someone younger than you. It's not easy. I mean, it happens to me now and I don't like it. But I accept, and what I tell myself is that I am a good representative of the art of jiu-jitsu because of that. I'm better for it. And if people want bullshit, that's not on me. I'm going to give them reality. The reality is you can't stay in your prime forever. That's the reality. If you want to believe the mythology of 400, go ahead, man. Believe 400-0. But that's on you. And it's your lack of critical thinking, your lack of skepticism. It's not my fault. You know what I'm saying? Like, so I feel that instructors who give their students the truth are worthier martial artists. And I'm not trying to put myself in, like, I got many flaws, but I do make an effort to expose myself like that. And I'm like, I'm not scared of, training with my students. And if I did vegan practice, that's that. I have zero ambition to compete. People are like, oh, why don't you compete then? Because I don't care about it anymore. But I think that a lot of this idolizing of the past has to do with that. It's more about ego than it is about the growth of the art.
Yeah, okay, I hear that, and I think, that's probably resonates with my own personal view as well. My instructor's still competing, and I respect that, and that's something, my goal is to still keep competing and, still try and force myself to do those things. But what would you say maybe to someone, that, you're trying to tell the truth, but hey, these myths are out there. It's probably too late to change them. The myths have done some good in spreading jiu-jitsu and getting people involved, in helping the marketing and promotion. Maybe without the myths, we wouldn't even be doing jiu-jitsu. So, like,
honestly, man, I think that without the marketing, we would all be doing judo. The lies are part of it, like the exaggerations, the myths, they're all part of what we got us here. So are they necessary? I don't know, man. I don't have a good answer. Maybe they are. Maybe they're necessary because I wouldn't have a job if it weren't for those things. And we would have been absorbed and swallowed whole by the spread of judo. And maybe would have been better. Judo is a lot more, has a lot to teach Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in terms of its philosophy and approach to life and values of respect and hierarchy and I think there's something to be said about judo that we're missing in BJJ, and I like it. But as from a strictly martial perspective, from a combat perspective, I think they made way too many mistakes. They left too much out. They ignored too much of grappling. They don't let shots. A double and a single, you can't just shy. Why would you do that? Why would you eliminate a double leg? Does it work? Yes. Then why you eliminate it? Why would you eliminate a shoulder lock? Oh, you're going to get hurt. The takedowns don't hurt? Have you ever grappled? Takedowns hurt way more than submissions do. Sometimes I wonder, like, people that are making these rules, have you ever grappled? Like, do you have any experience in the sport, or are you just coming up with stuff from your head? Like, oh, I think that this is what's going to happen, so that's the new rule set. Very common thing in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu today. Promoters coming up with rules. They have zero experience competing, but they're making rules. Like, it's like me telling you what to do with your teeth. It's like me telling you, like, giving you advice on quantum physics. I don't know about it. I'm not going to give you advice. You want to create a rule set for jiu-jitsu, you talk to the competitors. People don't do that. Mm-hmm. Kind of come up with rules in their own head. And, like, Jigoro Kano made mistakes, man. Judo made mistakes.
Yeah, okay.
But as far as the philosophy goes, man, we have a lot to learn from them. So I think you could argue that we'd be better off doing judo today, but I don't like it nearly as much as I like BJJ.
Yeah, well, that's to talk about the philosophy, and that's one thing with judo. It was the way, and I think had elements of that Taoist philosophy in. And when they changed their name to jiu-jitsu, right, and which I think meant like just more techniques, there was some pushback with the judo because it's why you're taking that side of the philosophy side out. Is there anything to that?
Jigoro Kano Kano never refers to Kano Jiu-Jitsu, to my knowledge, but he was referred to by other people to Kano Jiu-Jitsu because everything was Jiu-Jitsu. So Kano was just another school out of many. But he does change it to judo after a while because he didn't like the association with professional fights, the circus, fixed fights. So he wanted to move away from all that and create a means to educate the public. And he could only do that with, by changing public perception. So that's why he tried to change the name. But there certainly is a lot to be said about judo as a means of education. I mean, you will go to a judo school today and you see that. It's very different from a Brazilian jiu-jitsu school. Maybe that's one reason why BJJ is so appealing. It's so lax, that the aspect of Brazilian culture. It's so chill, and it's such a break from like normal life work. What is work like? Deadlines, 9 to 5. Your boss, angry, hierarchy. And you go to the BJJ gym and your instructor's chill. He does this to you, and he fist bumps you, and he gives you a hug. And if you're late and he's not mad, and he jokes around with you, and you guys have dinner together afterwards, and it's such a break, Maybe that's why it's popular. But at the same time with that, sometimes the values aren't there. IBJJF created a platform for the growth of BJJ in terms of hierarchy, belt system, rules, tournaments, all that. But is the philosophy there? Where's the philosophy? What's the philosophy of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? Who influenced BJJ philosophically? They try to make Carlos that person, right? Helio tries to make her father that spiritual leader. But then you dig into that man's life this much. Is he really a worthy spiritual leader? I don't think so. I think anyone in her own biography, you can read it. What jumps at you is not a wise man. It's like, and that's in her. If you read Shockey and Tufi and other, it's a whole new ballgame. But even in her own biography, what comes across is not a noble man. So we're missing that. And it's good and bad. You get the lack of philosophy, but you get a very, happy environment with it. Brazilians are very happy people, but they're also very unorganized. So these things, you have to balance it out.
Yeah, it's funny. It's the good and the bad. I guess the yin yang, which I guess is Taoism, which is, judo the way. It's, I don't know what it all means. I don't know what it all means, but as you're describing that feeling of getting on the mats, one thing I do know for sure is I love jiu-jitsu, and at the moment I'm missing doing it. That's no doubt about that, That's
how I feel, man. That's how we all feel. And I wouldn't want it to be, I always give this as an example because to me, this is it's a very good argument in favor of the Gracie, the role of Carlos and Helio. Have you ever heard of Peruvian Jiu-Jitsu?
I have not.
Because it doesn't exist. You know why? Plenty of Japanese in Peru. We're not lacking. It was like Brazil, and after Brazil was like Peru, like the main destination for Japanese, right? Why?
Not sure.
I think I think that's where Carlos and Helio come in.
Yeah.
They're Japanese. The Japanese migrated everywhere. It wasn't just Brazil, right? So I think they played a role there. I think there's something there's something to be said about, it's not the old, but I think it did say something about their importance.
I get your point. Yeah. They did it.
And Hobson, this is something that's great. Like I love Hobson's interview, and he goes like this: what would Maeda be without Carlos? It's a very good question. Would you have heard of Maeda without Carlos?
Maybe not.
In other words, it wasn't Maeda who created Carlos. It was Carlos who created Maeda. Maeda, in Hobson's words, would be a legend of the Amazon without a man like Carlos Gracie to make him relevant. Because it's true, without him, who would have heard of Maeda today? He'd be a footnote in the annals of judo history. He'd be a footnote. Mm-hmm. No one would, There were Japanese who were allegedly better than Maeda at that time. We haven't heard of them because they didn't have their Carlos Gracie, someone that would, turn them into a mythological like creature. So one way or another, man, you can't deny their role, for better or for worse. It is what it is.
Yeah, of course. No, I think that it's a great point of just, look, they did it. They're the ones who did it. They actually made it happen. They took that and spread it worldwide and, created this massive, whatever you want to call it, culture that they've spread all across the globe. And they're the ones who put the rubber to the road and made things happen. And that is fact. They can't take that away.
And, you know, even though we've been accused of being pro-Gracie and anti-Gracie, I've been accused of being pro-Fada and anti-Fada. I've been accused of being pro-Brazil and anti-Brazil, pro-U.S. And, you know, it was never the intention. The intention was always to, you know, try to be accurate. And so hopefully people will enjoy it. It was a lot of work, a lot of our time. I do ask the community to support. We did this for the BJJ community, so we really hope that they support and help spread the word. Our best means of educating people is organically. It's something that is, you know, word of mouth and people talk about it. And so we're asking for everyone to help us as best they can.
I love it. I love it. And, you know, I can't wait to see it as well. I think it's, you know, just going through that history, it covers so many things that can be seen in society, you know, like the mythology and just how news is presented and how we latch on to things. It's just, you can kind of see echoes of, you know, what's happening today and, you know, starting off in the past. It's a great way of looking at it.
That was the goal. That was always the intention. But anyway, I really hope you guys support. We should be done by the end of our summer, your winter. And, you know, we have our website, closeguardfilm.com. You can subscribe, receive some of the, you know, news. You know, when we're about to release, we're going to be reaching out to you guys. And you can follow us on our Instagram page, closeguardthemovie.com. And, yeah, check us out. Like, support, spread the word. Try to make this something for everyone. And it's, you know, I think it's time we leave behind that linear, simplistic approach to BJJ.
I love it. I love it. Robert, Mr. Drysdale, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a great story, great chat, and make sure all those links go in the show notes, and I'll make sure to try and get the word out when the movie comes out. And thank you so much. I hope you've enjoyed it, and maybe can come back on in the future and we discuss your competitive career and all that stuff too. We'll do that, man. Maybe after the film is out, you can watch it, and then we can talk about it when it's out. That sounds perfect. Okay. Thanks, mate. I appreciate it. Thank you. Cheers. Bye.
You have been listening to the Sonny Brown Breakdown. Until next time, you can visit sonnybrown.net to find out more ways to break it down.